All right, everybody, welcome to this lecture. Today we are going to be talking about what may arguably be the most cataclysmic event in all of human history. An event that, if it had not occurred, you would not have seen the subsequent World War. And when we get to the end of this lecture, I'll be explaining why that is in fact the case. But World War I is it was deemed the war to end all wars, the Great War. And it was delineated in this fashion because of the carnage that was wrought by the war. As we will find out, this is a conflict where 10 million people died, largely European. 20 million more dying of disease and other types of wounds, and many more still prisoners of war, right? By contrast, just to give you sort of a sense of the scope of World War I, by contrast, the American Civil War, which lasted 4 years, what is in fact the most bloody war for Americans. And what I mean by that is more Americans died in the U.S. Civil War than any other war that they've ever fought in. And so by contrast, Americans lost about 640,000 people in the American Civil War. So here, you know, it's a big difference. And the reason for these differences, as we will see, is of course due to technological changes and innovation. The same types of industrial advancements that were bringing about cars and vacuum cleaners, right? These are the same technological advancements that will bring about tanks and planes and machine guns. And frankly, by the time the war erupts in 1914, the world is not prepared for these new types of weapons, and it will make this war incredibly bloody. So with that, let me go ahead and dive into this. This is not really a war that Americans know a whole lot about because, frankly, we did not get involved in it until 1917. Troops didn't really get over there until 1918, and then the thing came to an end in 1918. So I'm going to be talking a lot about what the United States' position was when this war is going on. But before I do that, I think it's important to provide a general overview, of how this thing began. And then I'm going to give you a couple of films to watch, which will cover a little bit of the military history of the war. So, all right, with that said, let's move forward. Okay, it says here, prior to the 20th century, America's geographic distance from Europe helped to support its isolationist philosophy. Okay, and the reality is that for the most part, Americans had a isolationist position. They felt very comfortable where they were geographically because if something were to go on in Asia, well, they had the Pacific Ocean to distance them from those conflicts. And the same could be true about the Atlantic Ocean, keeping America distanced from European affairs. And so when we move into the 20th century and World War I erupts in 1914, the U.S. and Americans as a whole have this sort of sense that this isn't our problem because we have these oceans that sort of separate us from that. But of course, with technological advancement, the world has gotten smaller, right? But that was the idea here, right? It says by the 20th century, this comfortable isolation, right? There's this idea that we can be isolated, we can be neutral. Unfortunately, and Americans genuinely, I believe, didn't really understand this, but it says here that this comfortable isolation, however, began to fall apart, right? New technologies, ships, planes, the underwater telegraph system, right? These types of technologies bring the continents closer together, right? We can meet one another more quickly, more rapidly than we had ever been able to do before. And, you know, in this regard, technology made that isolation sort of disappear. Okay. We also will note that the United States had a lot of economic interests in Europe, and so when Europeans and Asians go to war, or Middle Easterners go to war, right? If you have your hands in their pocketbooks because you trade with them, well, then you're gonna end up getting sucked into their situation as well. Unfortunately for the United States, as we will see, the U.S. will maintain and keep this sort of sense of idea that they were neutral, that they were isolated, but at the same time they will continue to try to trade with these various warring nations. And as you all, I'm sure, could understand, right? You cannot claim neutrality while at the same time trying to trade with the various warring nations, right? It goes on to state here at the bottom that the election of Woodrow Wilson to the presidency in 1912 would actually further tie the United States to the fates of Europe and Asia, as he, quote, sought to impose his standards for right conduct on renegade nations. Indeed, one of the things that Woodrow Wilson will argue in 1917 when we go to war with Germany and Austria-Hungary is that we need to make the world safe for democracy, right? We are sort of this police power, if you will. And so, again, this is just sort of an opening salvo that throughout most of World War I, the United States is going to maintain this sort of belief that it is neutral, that it is isolated. But it will also be economically tied to the war because it continues to trade with the war, and as we will see, it will be sucked in to the conflict, perhaps against its own desires. So, with that, let's move forward. All right, who is Woodrow Wilson? Woodrow Wilson was the only president, I believe still up to this date, to have held a doctoral degree. He was an ex-history professor, and so he's an academic, right? But what he isn't is someone who has practical, applicational understanding of the way that the world works. And in fact, he's not someone who has a whole lot of understanding about foreign policy and the way in which foreign policy should function. And in fact, at one point he had said, it would be an irony of fate if my administration had to deal chiefly with foreign affairs. And of course, genuinely it did. Whether or not we were physically involved in the war, his administration most definitely had to contend and deal with the issues going on in Europe, despite the oceans that separated us. And so it's a bit ironic that he makes this statement, because that's, of course, exactly what happens. His administration becomes overwhelmed by foreign affairs. It goes on to state here that by that time he was elected, however, the United States had begun to rely greatly upon Europe, predominantly in trade, and thus the United States was directly linked to the fate of many Europeans. And again, I've already mentioned that. It goes on to state here that when World War I broke out in Europe in 1914, the United States was drawn into it because of these economic ties. It says, though the U.S. would attempt to remain neutral, at least in the beginning, right? But despite all the efforts, the United States would be drawn into World War I, and ultimately in 1917, our troops, our American doughboys, as they were referred to, will be sent over to Europe to fight the good fight, if you will, to, as Wilson would argue, to make the world safe for democracy. Okay. So the question now has to be asked, how does this war start? What are the causes of such a cataclysmic event? So what I want to do over the next couple slides is just to sort of digest some of the basic causes for the war, and then we will look briefly at America's response to the war as it's unfolding, and then look briefly at America's role in the war. So with that, let's dive into the causes. Preceding World War I, again in 1914, Europeans had been experiencing a relative period of peace, and to understand why that's important, you have to sort of go back in European history a bit. Right, in 1792, or actually 1789, I think it was, in the latter part of the 18th century, the French experienced a revolution, and that revolution might well be one of the most significant historical events ever, because of the way in which it changed the world, specifically Europe. But following the French Revolution, you have the Napoleonic Wars. And Napoleon Bonaparte wreaks havoc across Europe. In 1804, he names himself the Emperor of France, and then he very successfully, for the next 10 or so years, will depose monarchs and establish French rule throughout throughout much of Europe. Now, this reign of terror, depending upon your point of view, comes to an end in 1815 when Napoleon is defeated at Waterloo. Following Napoleon's defeat, Europeans attempt to try to put Europe back together. And generally speaking, there is a period of peace. There are no major wars that are going on. There are some small moves towards independence and revolution, but not in a way that would be comparable to the Napoleonic Wars, right? And so this period of peace in Europe is so long lasting that many Europeans come to conclude that peace is just the way of life, that humanity has evolved beyond the need for warfare. And as it says here, they had this belief that harmony would be permanent, right? And because they are under this conception that there are no problems brewing, they are not actually very aware of the problems that are in fact actually brewing. It says here that despite this belief that humanity had evolved beyond the need for war, it says many forces were at work which would not only shatter this perception but would bring about the first truly total war, and by far the most destructive war up to that point, eclipsed only by World War II, right? And so we have to understand that despite the perceptions of Europeans at the time, and I don't mean to generalize and say that all Europeans were under this perception, but enough of them were. But it's important to recognize that despite this perception, these forces, there are certain things at work that will create a bunch of pressure in Europe, and specifically in an area of Europe known as the Balkans, the Balkan Peninsula, which is referred to as the powder keg, because if something was going to explode somewhere, it was going to explode in the Balkan Peninsula, and sure enough, that's exactly where the straw which broke the camel's back, which started World War I, it occurs in the Balkan Peninsula, in that powder keg, right? But these various forces build up over time. Think of like a hot dog, and this is an awkward analogy, but it seems to work. Think of a hot dog in a microwave that you've put in there, right? And if you leave it in there too long, eventually so much pressure builds that the thing explodes all over the microwave, right? That's kind of what happens to Europe. You have these various pressures, and you forgot that the hot dog was in the microwave, and you leave it in there too long, and then boom, those last couple seconds hit the hot dog, and it explodes. Such it was with Europe. So let's take a look at some of these forces. What were the causes of this conflict? And let's move forward. Nationalism. All right, nationalism is one of the major causes of World War I. And we've talked briefly about nationalism when we talked about, the American imperialistic spirit, right? This idea that nationalists, which is a strong sense of imperialism, right? I'm sorry. It's a strong sense of patriotism, right? You think much of yourself as a nation, right? And in the United States, it's fine. We can be extremely nationalistic because we don't have too many countries who quickly surround us. But in Europe, there are many small nations which surround one another, and when all of them are incredibly nationalistic, it causes competition. Right? It's like having far too many type A personalities in the room, too many leaders and no followers, right? You're very much not going to get anywhere because everyone thinks that they've got the greatest ideas, and that's sort of what's going on in Europe. It says here that nationalism was one of the contributing factors that led to war, and by the early 1900s, nationalism caused many European nations to compete with each other for power. And we've got just a few of those powers listed here for you. Okay, it says right here, this faction, this pressure developed from competition over natural resources in various nations, trade markets, and territorial disputes. Okay, there were other factors which led to nationalism being, growing within each nation, but these are some good reasons why you would see nationalism flare up, right? It says much of the origin of the war, in fact, was based on the desire of the Slavic peoples in Bosnia and Herzegovina to no longer be part of Austria-Hungary, but instead be part of Serbia. Okay, one of the things you have to understand here is that In the 1450s, there was an empire known as the Ottoman Empire, and Mehmet the Conqueror in 1452 conquered a city known as Constantinople. Today it's referred to as Istanbul. And when the Ottoman Empire conquered that region, it grew over the next 200-300 years. And in about the 1700s, the Ottoman Empire's power began to slowly decline. But during the height of its power, it had absorbed so many different people groups that it had various different nationalities within its one empire. Well, by the 1900s, the Ottoman Empire begins to break apart, and many of these nationalities, right, begin to want to establish nations of their own. Well, this was going to happen between Austro-Hungary and Serbia, because the people who were residing in Bosnia and Herzegovina were largely Serbs. And so Serbia thought, because the people in Bosnia and Herzegovina are nationally Serbs, they should be part of Serbia. Austria-Hungary, on the other hand, wanted control of these regions, despite the fact that they were Austro-Hungarian and not Serbs, right? And so this causes tension between Austria-Hungary and Serbia. And in fact, when you look at the next slide, you're going to see a map of this region. You can sort of get a geographic sense of what we're talking about. Ultimately, Austria-Hungary will take control over Bosnia and Herzegovina, and that will cause significant tension between Serbia and Austria-Hungary, because you're dealing with an issue of nationalism. You're dealing with an issue of Austria-Hungary is acquiring territories largely dominated, demography that is, of Serbs. Serbia thinks that they should be rightfully theirs. Okay? It says, in this way, nationalism led directly to the war. But in a more general way, the nationalism of the various countries throughout Europe contributed not only to the beginning, but to the extension of the war. Each country tried to prove their dominance and power. Okay? So let's move on to the next slide, and you can take a look at what Europe looks like before World War I, so you can sort of get a feel for what we're dealing with here. Okay, what you have here is a map delineating Europe prior to World War I. It looks radically different than it does today. And you can see here, if you look right here in the middle, where Austro-Hungary is, and just south of that is Serbia. That is the Balkan Peninsula. Okay, and World War I will begin. If you look again there at Serbia, that is where World War I, the last thing that's going to happen, which is the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand. That's going to be the thing that's going to ignite war again in the Balkan Peninsula, the powder keg. All right, but you can see the Ottoman Empire further down, and you've got these various nations that are going to be competing with one another for land, competing with each other for territory. Right, sort of redundant there, but nonetheless. Okay, that's what it looks like. Just so you sort of get a sense of Europe before World War I. All right, so force number one. Nationalism. Okay, based upon what we can see here, we can then extrapolate and look at what cause number two is, and that's actually going to be imperialism. Right, so let's move on to the next slide. Another factor is imperialism. So defined, imperialism is when a country increases their power and wealth by bringing additional territories under their control. In fact, we saw this with the United States at the turn of the 19th century, where we begin to imperialize Hawaii and Alaska and the Philippines and other places as well, right? Okay, but that's also going to occur in Europe. It says before World War I, Africa and parts of Asia were points of contention among the European countries. Now, many nationalists want to imperialize other nations because they have those raw materials that industrializing nations want. They have markets that they can then open up, right? That again, industrializing nations want. And so various territories become seeds of disagreement over various nations. Think of it like it's a super hot day. You've got two young kids who run in, and there's one fudge sickle left in the freezer. Okay, there will be blood. Okay, it's going to happen. Okay, you can't have two hot, hungry kids and one fudgesicle. They're going to be fighting over the fudgesicle. Okay, well, that's what happened in Europe. You have one portion of territory that many people want, and so they begin to fight over it. Okay, now why are these nations in contention? It says this was especially true because of the raw materials these areas provided. The increasing competition and desire for greater empires led to an increase in confrontation that helped push the world toward war. Okay? In fact, it even says that in both 1905 and 1911, Germany and France almost went to war over the state of Morocco. Okay? Now, eventually, we will go to war in 1914 with the assassination of Franz Ferdinand over issues of Bosnia and Herzegovina and who should have the right to control that. But again, nationalism, imperialism, both of these factors are very much interwoven, right? Once you become extremely nationalistic, you want to prove that nationalism by growing your empire, and the only way to do that at this point in history is to imperialize other nations, right? And so imperialism is another factor. Okay? A third factor would be, and let's move forward, a third factor is militarism. And militarism is essentially the glorification of military power, right? Militarism is the build-up of armaments. And the truth of the matter is, at least as far as I'm concerned, is that if you're going to start building up battleships and guns, and you're increasing your navy and your army, right? You're doing this because you intend to use these things, right? Whether that is to imperialize other countries or to wage war. But what happens in Europe is a bunch of nations, Germany and Great Britain, for example, they go to war with each other over an armament race. Who can build the bigger, badder battleship, if you will, right? It says militarism stressed the importance of creating and maintaining a standing army and using new technologies to build bigger, better weapons. It says as the world entered the 20th century, an armament race had begun. By 1914, Germany had the greatest increase in military buildup, and then Great Britain and Germany both greatly increased their navies in this time period as well. And that creates tension. It says further, in Germany and Russia particularly, the military establishment began to have a greater influence on public policy. This increase in militarism helped push the countries involved to war. And again, this is incredibly linked to nationalism and imperialism, right? If you are a nationalist nation, and many people were in Europe, then you want to prove how great you are by, again, imperializing other nations and building an empire. And the only way to successfully do that is to have the bigger gun on the battlefield. And so militarism falls in line right with it. And so all of these forces act together, and they're going to create an environment that is tense and that will eventually erupt. Okay? Before the war begins, however, there is one final cause I want to briefly mention to you, and that is a system of alliances that was created. Okay? Okay, before we get going any further on this slide, what I want you to do is to click on that title, The Coming of War, and read that material, because it's going to briefly talk about some of the alliance system. It's going to give you a couple terms that you need to know, known as the Triple Entente and the Triple Alliance. So please click on that and then start this slide over, all right? Okay, it says here that over time, countries throughout Europe made mutual defense agreements, and that you read the website I asked you to read, that should have been made clear to you, right? You've got the Triple Alliance and the Triple Entente, and they're responding to each other, and effectively what you can see here is that with the Triple Entente and the Triple Alliance, the European nations are effectively dividing themselves into two camps of people. And what you really should think about this as far as an analogy is concerned is if you have a buddy who gets into a fight, right, you're likely to jump in and help. And then their buddies are likely to jump in and help, and before you know it, the whole school is in a war with each other, right, over this one particular confrontation between two people. And that's what happens in Europe. You have this system of alliances between the Triple Entente, the Triple Alliance, and then when war erupts, which it will, because Austria-Hungary will declare war on Serbia. And when that occurs, then all their buddies, all this alliance comes into play. Right? So again, it says, over time, countries throughout Europe made mutual defense agreements that would pull them into battle. Thus, if one country was attacked, allied countries were bound to defend them. Before World War I, the following alliances existed. Russia and Serbia were allies, as was France and Russia, as was Britain with Belgium and France. And then, of course, France, Belgium, and Britain were also allied with Russia. Okay? You also have Germany and Austria-Hungary. The Ottoman Empire is also an ally of Germany. And so you have all this system of alliances coming together. Now, when the war erupts, those titles, Triple Entente and Triple Alliance, they go away, and you get something called the Central Powers and the Allied Powers. The Central Powers being Germany, Austria-Hungary, predominantly, and the Allied Powers being Britain, France, and Russia, and then eventually in 1917, the United States, albeit the United States sort of maintained its own independent military, but for general purposes, they were part of the Allied forces. Okay, it says in 1912, Austria-Hungary declared war on Serbia, and we'll talk why they did that here in a second. It says Russia got involved to defend Serbia. Seeing Russia defend Serbia, Germany came and declared war on Russia. France was then drawn in against Germany. And then when Germany invaded Belgium, Great Britain came in to defend Belgium, which was something that Germany did not think that Great Britain would do. But then it happened, right? And while all of that's going on, for the most part, the United States is remaining neutral. They're not getting engaged. They don't get engaged again until 1917, and really don't show up in any major way until 1918, because we had to mobilize troops, train them, and get them over there. Okay? But these are your major forces behind World War I, right? Nationalism, imperialism, militarism, and a series of alliances that ultimately meant that when one country declared war against another one, all those alliances would fall into place, and thus you get a world war. So what is the thing that breaks the camel's back? What's the spark which sets the powder keg off in the Balkan Peninsula? The thing that sets the Balkan Peninsula off is the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand, and therefore that would really be the final cause of World War I. So let's briefly look at that. It says the immediate cause of World War I that made all the aforementioned items come into play was the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand of Austria-Hungary. Now remember, I had been mentioning to you that there was a debate, a battle, if you will, between Austria-Hungary and Serbia over the territory of Bosnia and Herzegovina. Well, what happens is Austria-Hungary took control of Bosnia, and in 1914, June of 1914, Franz Ferdinand, who is basically one of the figureheads of Austria-Hungary, goes into Sarajevo, which is the capital of Bosnia, and there are a lot of Serbs in Bosnia who want to see Serbia take control. And what happens is a gentleman by the name of Gavrilo Princip assassinates Archduke Franz Ferdinand. He is part of a terrorist group known as the Black Hand. And of course, the reason why he does this, as it says, is this was in protest to Austria-Hungary having control of the region. It says Serbia wanted to take over Bosnia and Herzegovina, thus they assassinate the Archduke. It says this assassination led to Austria-Hungary declaring war on Serbia. It says when Russia began to mobilize due to its alliance with Serbia, Germany then declared war on Russia, and boom, you have World War I. Now what I want you to do is I have two short films here I want you to watch. The first film, it says here short film 1, that's going to talk about something known as the Schlieffen Plan. The Schlieffen Plan was a plan enacted by Germany early on in the war, August of 1914, where they're having to deal with a war on two fronts. Because they do not have an alliance with France or Russia, they have to fight a war on two fronts, one from the west, one from the east. The Schlieffen Plan was an attempt to invade France, destroy the French, and then move into Russia to take out the Russians. The Germans were under the impression that Russia would mobilize very slowly, and they also did not believe that Great Britain would come to the aid of Belgium once they invaded Belgium. Both of these things turned out to be false. Russia mobilized much more quickly than Germany expected, and Great Britain did come to the aid of Belgium, and thus what you will find is that the Schlieffen Plan will stall and fail. Okay, and that's what the first film is going to talk about. The second film is going to provide for you a very cursory military history, an overview of World War I. I'm not going to necessarily cover many battles. In fact, I don't cover any of the battles here. And so this is going to give you a sense of how World War I developed militaristically, and you need to watch both of these films to sort of get that context. Okay, so watch those, and then we'll move forward. Okay, hopefully those films were beneficial and helpful in sort of laying sort of a context of how the fighting unraveled. But what you have early on in the war is America remains neutral. And it says here that as the war progressed, it became very clear that it would be the, quote, war to end all wars. And of course, at the time, no one could have known that it was going to be eclipsed by World War II. But it was. But at the time, again, this is the war to end all wars. This is the sheer size and scope of each battle attested to the fact that this war was different. There was something unique about this, right? And what was unique about this was the type of technology being employed, right? The strategies of war had not changed much since the 19th century, but the weapons had. And so because of that, in fact, as you saw in the last film, right? Because of the weapons, you're going to create a war that's going to be forced to be fought via trench warfare. You're going to be fighting fairly stationary, and generally there was a long line stretched near the French and German borders, right, that they're going to be fighting in, okay? Simply because the strategies of war could not keep up with the technology. In fact, an example of that here is that during the Battle of Verdun, for instance, which occurred between February through December of 1916 in France, some 32 million shells were fired, which is about 1,500 shells for every square meter of the battlefield, right? Technology changed the scope of war, okay? In fact, what you get in World War I is this thing known as no man's land. And no man's land was the stretch of territory between the trenches. Okay, you would have one line of trenches fought by one side and one line of trenches fought by the other side, and above that was a land of barbed wire and bombed out territory, right, that no one really wanted to go to. Okay, what I want to read to you real quickly here before I have you watch the film that's connected with that title there, No Man's Land, is I want to read something to you about the weapons. And it says, as the fighting unfolded, it quickly became apparent that the First World War was unlike any previous conflict in its scope and carnage, because military tactics had not kept up with military technology. Machine guns, which was the most significant weapon in World War I, by the way, that was the game changer. Machine guns, high-velocity rifles, aerial bombing, poison gas, flamethrowers, landmines, long-range artillery, like Big Bertha, which you saw earlier in the film before, and armored tanks changed the nature of warfare and produced massive casualties and widespread destruction. Over 61 million men served in the armed forces on both sides, and over 9 million combatants were killed in action. Another 19 million were wounded. Okay? Moving on, it says, trench warfare became a mainstay of World War I. Life in the trenches was miserable. Now, the reason why there's trench warfare is because people don't know how to deal with machine guns, right? I mean, during the American Civil War, a good shot could get off about 3 shots a minute. You're now looking at machine guns which could rattle off 5, 6, maybe 700 rounds a minute. And so in order to protect yourself from that, you have to dig these trenches to get below where the bullets would fly. And it says life in the trenches was miserable. In addition to the dangers of enemy fire, soldiers on both sides were forced to deal with flooding and diseases such as trench fever and trench foot, which could lead to amputation. Lice and rats were constant companions. It goes on to state that the stench was unbearable. Soldiers on both sides ate, slept, and fought among the dead and amid the reek of death. Okay? Now what I want you to do is I want you to watch this film, No Man's Land, and it's going to cover more of these weapons for you. It's going to talk about trench warfare. It's going to talk about the weapons of war, a little bit about poison gas and planes and what have you. Okay? But the reason why I bring this up is because despite the carnage of World War I, despite the horrific stories, the United States remains neutral. Okay? So, watch that film, and then let's go ahead and talk a bit more about this neutrality and what America does before it enters into the war. Okay, hopefully that film was enlightening to you. I know there's a couple times in there where the organization of the film isn't so great. It's a bit choppy, but it should have given you a general idea of what the weapons were like. And it says here that those stories of war streamed into the United States. Americans were not quick to join the conflict. It says instead they sought to remain neutral, both, as Woodrow Wilson would argue for us to do. He said that we should be neutral in thought as well as in action, right? And what he means by that is we're not going to physically get involved in this conflict, but you also, as American citizens and others, should not even mentally choose sides, right? We should remain as neutral as possible. And again, I've already mentioned that that's a bit difficult to do when you're trading with warring nations. But this is what Woodrow Wilson is asking for his Americans to do, is to remain neutral in thought as well as action. And in fact, people were so convinced that they were going to be invincible from this war that the Literary Digest wrote, quote, "Our isolated position and freedom from entangling alliances inspire our press with cheering assurance that we are in no peril of being drawn into the European quarrel." Well, the Literary Digest sort of put the horse before the cart, because the reality is that the United States was entangled in these alliances. I've already mentioned to you that we were economically tangled, right? We were trading with both sides. But beyond economic considerations, there was also some cultural considerations that the Literary Digest didn't take into consideration, right? It says by 1914, 32 million Americans had kinship ties with Europe. There were about 8 million German Americans in the United States when World War erupted. You don't think that these German Americans are taking a side? You don't think they have a vested interest in what's going on in their fatherland? Of course they do, right? You can't ask these groups of people to be mentally detached from what's going on in their ancestral home, or perhaps their actual home that they came from. And so that ties the United States into the war. It says most Anglo-Americans, what we might refer to as white Americans, on the other hand, held cultural ties with England, right? So they're going to be mentally connected to the Allied powers. It says, as a result, both the British and German people launched intense propaganda campaigns in the United States in order to gain support for the war effort, right? We are entangled in this war, whether or not we wanted to like it, whether or not we wanted to admit it. The United States was entangled, and it will only become more so as the thing goes on, in large part because the United States is going to be the target of what the Germans called unrestricted submarine warfare. Many of America's merchant vessels and military vessels, as well as other Western vessels, will be unrestrictedly attacked by by German U-boats, by their submarine boats. And this is going to draw the United States into the war. So, with that, let's move on. Okay, it says that while the U.S. was clearly entangled in the war effort, it had not yet declared war, and thus it was a quote-unquote neutral nation. And again, I use that term neutral in quotations because, as we saw, really it's not that neutral. But it says here that as a result, many Americans believed that the United States should be able to conduct its wartime trade without interference, right? The United States is a sovereign nation, and therefore it should be permitted to continue its trade with whomever it wishes, whether or not they are peaceful people or warring people. We are a nation that is independent and should be permitted to trade with whomever we wish, right? It says, because World War I was largely fought in trenches, the continual supply of goods and munitions to those trenches became a matter of grave importance, and the United States understood this, right? They recognized the economic potential to trade with various nations, right? The problem with this, of course, is that Germany doesn't want you trading with Britain, and Britain doesn't want us trading with Austria-Hungary, and so you could find yourself really getting on the negatives, on the bad list of these nations. And the nation that really we got on the bad list with was Germany, and they will use unrestricted subwarfare to halt American trade. It says, as a result, American politicians hoped that they might maintain peace on the sea so as to conduct their wartime trade, which I think is interesting, that we're going to try and be a peaceful nation economically, but we're selling goods of war to warring nations, right? And you can't hold that up for very long. And as this goes on to state, it says, but as time went on, Americans and their vessels, both military and ocean liner, would come under German U-boat attack. And to be honest, unrestricted submarine warfare is one of the main reasons why the United States decides to enter into World War I. It's not the only reason, but it's one of the main ones, okay? All right, let's move on. All right, continuing on. It says, the use of U-boats was a violation of standard rules of maritime procedure. U-boats are submarine boats, and at this point, there's no way to ping underneath you to find these things, right? They were the mysterious boat that you only knew they were there if they let you know that they were there, or they blew you up, right? And it even says that this was a violation of standard rules of maritime procedure, which demanded that all people aboard any neutral vessel to be attacked should have the time to unload both passengers and crew members for the sake of their own safety, right? Now, this does not apply to wartime vessels, right? We're not talking about battleships and other types of ships. These would be neutral ships, ocean liners, merchant vessels, right? The problem, and this is sort of looking at it from the Germans' point of view, is that the problem was that British frequently flew neutral flags on their various ships in order to disguise what those ships actually were. And so, Germany and Austria-Hungary and others, they discover this stuff out, right? They know that the British are doing this, and so they have a couple options, right? They can choose to abide by the procedure and allow these crew members to get off, probably military personnel, or they could just blow them up, knowing that the British have a tendency to fly neutral flags on ships that are anything but neutral, right? Well, the United States is going to get sunk into this as well, right? The Germans begin to believe that, if the British are flying these neutral vessels, perhaps they're using American vessels to supply themselves with various wartime goods. It says, still holding onto their neutral stance, the United States, quote, pronounced the German policy of sinking neutral vessels as an indefensible violation of neutral rights. And they warned that Germany would be held to a strict accountability for any destruction of American lives and property. Now, this is an interesting thing to state from the United States because, of course, we're arguing that we're a neutral nation, and yet we are giving Germany sort of this ultimatum that if you blow our ships up, we will have to hold you accountable. Well, that's big talk from a neutral nation, because you can't claim neutrality, as we were doing, and then threaten to hold Germany accountable for an action that they took against you. Those are talks of war, right? Now, the United States gives this ultimatum to Germany, to stop it or there will be consequences. And then the United States has an opportunity to hold up, its end of the ultimatum. It says the opportunity for America to hold true to their word came on May 7th, 1915, when the Germans use their subboats and blow things up again. So the United States reaction to this is not to send troops in. Instead, we send letters, strongly worded letters. It's like, I'm going to send you a strongly worded email. And, that's going to get my point across. And ultimately, it does very little to halt or stop the German unrestricted subwarfare. Nonetheless, the United States is suggesting that it is not. It's doing more than suggesting. It is saying that it is neutral. But actions like this sort of evidence the fact that the United States was not very neutral. In fact, it sort of suggests, more than suggests, that they had allied themselves with the Allied powers. So, that said, let's move forward. All right, the Germans pushed their luck and used unrestricted submarine warfare on a ship known as the Lusitania, and this occurred on the morning of May 7th, 1915. Now, what actually happened before the attack on the Lusitania, which, to be fair, was not an American liner. There just happened to be Americans on that liner, and 128 of the 1,198 people who died were Americans. But what the Germans do is they publish in American newspapers a warning to Americans saying, do not go on ships that you know are going to be traveling in waters that are being used for war purposes, right? Because if you go on these liners and they enter war waters, waters that are being delineated as, environments for war, then those boats, those ships will be sunk without warning. Okay, so the German embassy actually provides a warning to Americans: do not go on various ships that are going to enter into war zones. Okay, it says as the day progressed, German U-boats spotted a 4-stacked liner moving across the Irish Sea, which was a restricted war zone area, and as a result, German U-boats fired a torpedo directly at the vessel, sinking it within minutes. The liner was called the Lusitania. 128 Americans killed. Okay, this is another major cause of America's desire to enter into World War I. They blew up the Lusitania and killed Americans in the process. Right? It says in response, the United States called for war. Okay? And Teddy Roosevelt called the event an act of piracy. It says Americans were outraged. And I'm reading from my book America at the moment. Americans were outraged. The sinking was an act of piracy, TR declared. To quiet the uproar, Wilson urged patience. He said, we must be patient. He says, and I'm quoting Wilson, he says, quote, there is such a thing as a man being too proud to fight. But there is also such a thing as a nation being so right that it does not need to convince others by force that it is right. Right? In other words, Wilson says, look, TR, you're right. We probably could go to war, but we don't need to go to war because the world is going to see that what Germany did was wrong and that the United States is correct, that the United States is right. Okay? And so we don't need to go to war with Germany. The problem with this point of view, however, is this. Our previous demand for strict accountability demanded that the United States respond. Okay? Wilson cannot just sit back and just allow this to happen without repercussions, because we had just told Germany, if you continue in this unrestricted sub-warfare, then you will be held to, quote, strict accountability. Well, boom, they blow up the Lusitania, 128 Americans are dead. What are you going to do, Wilson? What are you going to do? Right? That's the big question of the hour. Okay, what you're seeing here is a newspaper from the New York Times that was published on the Lusitania. It says, Lusitania sunk by a submarine, probably 1,260 dead, twice torpedoed off Irish coast, sinks in 15 minutes. Captain Turner saved Forham and Vanderbilt missing. Washington believes that a grave crisis is at hand, right? And you can see what the Lusitania there looked like. But this was kind of like akin to when the Maine blew up in the right before the Spanish-American War, or the Alamo. You just remember the Lusitania. Lusitania becomes sort of a rallying cry for war hawks who want the United States to go to war. But not everybody wants the United States to go to war. In fact, there are some who would say, hey, let's comply with German demands and just don't go on these ships. Okay? And that's an interesting thing to say. Okay? And so we're going to talk a little bit about that now. It says, looking to avoid another Lusitania incident, doves in Congress, and doves is a term given to anti-war individuals in Congress. Hawks is the counterpart to that. Hawks tend to want to go to war. But it says, doves in Congress, those who opposed war, look to challenge the policy on neutral rights held by the Wilson administration. It says by 1916, a number of resolutions were introduced in the House and Senate warning Americans against traveling on armed vessels. Okay? In other words, Doves are saying, all right, look, we don't have to go to war to stop Germany from killing Americans. All we have to do is just not travel on armed vessels. Which, I mean, there's a lot of logic to that. But Wilson is opposed to these resolutions, right? Because he basically says that if we do this, if we choose not to ride on vessels that are armed, we are surrendering our rights. He says we would be surrendering of rights. This would be a deliberate abdication of our hitherto proud position as spokesmen, even amidst the turmoil of war. He says, look here, Doves, you know what? Yeah, I don't really want to go to war right now, but at the same time, if we listen to the German embassy and we just don't ride on these ships, then we are giving up our right to speak, and we cannot do that. It says Wilson was able to defeat both resolutions, but on March 24th, 1916, a German U-boat torpedoed the French steamer Sussex and injured 2 Americans in the process. It says Germany said that they would halt their unrestricted submarine warfare. That doesn't happen. In fact, right before the United States joins the war, they actually pronounce a policy of unrestricted submarine warfare. Right? That's going to be their policy against the United States. So, this is a major problem for the U.S., particularly this Lusitania incident. Okay, how do you deal with Germany when we are a neutral nation, and yet clearly they are deliberately and unrelentlessly attacking Americans, right? And the United States isn't fighting back. Okay, it says following the attack on the Lusitania, Woodrow Wilson found himself in another election year, and he will be reelected, and he's reelected because he's kind of a guy that appeals to a lot of people. He is one of our progressive presidents, and he actually campaigns on a program of social legislation and progressivism, right? He forwards its women's suffrage and the right for women to vote. So, progressives seem to like him, but he's also campaigning on I kept us out of war, right? I maintained neutrality, okay? It says, above all else, Wilson's success in the 1916 election was due to the fact that he ran on a peace with honor campaign and continually reminded Americans that he was the one who kept them out of war. And he will be reelected. I think he wins something like 277 electoral votes. You might want to check that number, but I think that's about right. Yes, it's 277 electoral votes. I mean, he doesn't win by a landslide. He wins like 9 million votes, and his opponent won 8.5. So it's not like he doesn't win by a landslide, but he still wins. Now, ironically, despite his "I kept us out of war," things are about to develop that are going to have to push his hand and force him into war. Okay. It says, all that said, one of Wilson's main concerns was the dramatic territorial claims that the nations, and when I say the nations, I mean the warring nations like Germany and France, okay? He's concerned with the territorial claims that these nations were arguing that they should get once the war came to an end. Okay? It says for Wilson, he came to understand that the war would only end if there was no apparent victor. He said we needed, quote, peace without victory. And what that means is that Wilson recognized that if any particular nation can claim to be the victor, then they're going to lord it over other people, and you won't have peace. If any nation acquires more territory than another nation, then they're going to lord it over other people, and you're not going to have peace. Okay? And Wilson is very interested in helping to develop a post-war peace. In fact, he drafts what we now call Wilson's 14 points, so-called because it had 14 points to it. And he's going to try to be a spokesperson of peace in the post-war period, right? He wants to be instrumental and fundamental in creating a post-war peace that will last for generations. Okay, it says, so as to accomplish this peace, Wilson addressed Congress on January 22nd, 1917, and asserted that the United States had the right, quote, to share in laying the foundations for a lasting peace. a peace among equals. And perhaps we did, and perhaps what Wilson wanted to do was correct. But the problem with this is that the United States is still maintaining its neutrality. How is it that a neutral nation should be permitted, and this is my speculation and just a question I'm asking, how is it that a neutral nation should then view itself as having a right to sit down at the post-peace treaty discussions? The United States has not, at this point, been privy to the war in any militaristic way, right? So why and how should it have the right to dictate a peace treaty? Well, that's an interesting question. But by Wilson making this point, by Wilson claiming that the United States should be able to share in laying the foundations, he is entangling himself even further in this war because he has a vested interest in it, and he's going to try to sway people from making claims of territorial acquisition. It says this peace would include freedom of the seas for all nations and a move toward disarmament. It says to ensure the success of each of these goals, Wilson proposed a League of Peace. And that League of Peace became known as the League of Nations, which today you know it as the United Nations, right? And basically the League of Peace, the League of Nations, their objective was to come together and speak about the various problems that nations had instead of going to war, right? According to my book, it says, although Wilson did not know it, he was already too late. Exactly 2 weeks before he spoke to Congress, impatient German military leaders had decided to wage unrestricted submarine warfare. It says they, meaning the Germans, took the calculated risk of provoking American anger in the hope of scoring a quick knockout. On January 31st, the new policy was announced, effective the next day. All vessels in the war zone, belligerent or neutral, would be sunk without warning. Freedom of the seas, said the Brooklyn Eagle, will now be enjoyed only by icebergs and fish. And ultimately what this means is that Germany is declared war against the United States. We're just not fighting back, at least not yet. Okay? But what we are doing, and what Wilson was doing, is trying to establish and devise this peace, right? Which he will get to a degree. All right, let's move on. Okay, it says, despite all of Wilson's efforts, the United States would end up declaring war upon the Central Powers on April 6th, 1917, after Germany pushed their luck 2 more times. The first time was the German Foreign Secretary, Arthur Zimmermann. He writes a telegram to the German ambassador in Mexico. And basically what the telegram said was that if Mexico would ally with Germany, if Germany won the war, then Germany would return to Mexico all of the land that the United States had acquired from Mexico during the Mexican-American War. Effectively, what the Zimmermann note or telegram said was that the Germany had intentions to invade the United States, right, to bring them into this war. And should Mexico ally with Germany, then upon America's loss, they would then lose territory. Now, this note is intercepted, it's decoded, and it's handed off to the United States, right? And boom, we know exactly what the intention is here. And that's, I mean, that's sort of a declaration of war right there. And so, you know, when we're talking about why did the United States get involved, they get involved because, one, Germany habitually and unrelentlessly engaged in unrestricted submarine warfare, sinking merchant vessels, sinking the Lusitania, and the Zimmermann telegram, which demonstrated to the United States that they did have an intention to declare war on the U.S. And so as a result, we will declare war on them. It says, realizing that a peace without victory was no longer possible, President Wilson, along with his cabinet, unanimously endorsed a declaration of war, and the following day the president called a special session of Congress in order to get that resolution passed. It says, meeting on April 2nd, 1917, Wilson urged the Senate to recognize the, quote, war Imperial Germany was already waging upon the United States. Okay, in other words, Wilson says, look, Germany's already at war with us. We're just not fighting back. The resolution went on to say that they, being Germany, were the enemy of liberty, and that the United States needed to join the fight in order to make the world safe for democracy. And then on April 6, 1917, Wilson signs the vote to go to war, and the United States will enter the war and send American doughboys over there into Europe to fight this conflict. And so America's neutrality is done. We are now part of the fray, okay? All right, moving on. All right, so we've now declared war on Germany, and what it says here is that when America first declared war upon Germany, it was unclear exactly how the United States would fight this war and exactly what role it would actually take. In fact, one historian noted here that few on either side of the Atlantic expected more from the United States than a token military effort. Now, part of the reason for that is the United States military prior to World War I was relatively small. It says, as you can see here, that there was about 379,000 men that the United States had in their standing army, which, if you recall any of the numbers that were given in the various films that you've watched, you'll note that that's not very many. Our Navy also was not up to standard, and so there's this idea that, yeah, the United States is joining the fray, but really, are they a strong military, and do they have the ability to make a change? And ultimately, the answer to that was yes. We would eventually send about 2 million or so men over to fight World War I. But initially, it wasn't quite clear what our role would look like, and so what we end up doing is we begin to pass various pieces of legislation to increase the size of the Navy, to increase the size of the military, and to begin to regulate peacetime commodities and transform them into wartime commodities. Okay, one of the things that is passed is the Selective Service Act of 1917. And when we move to the next slide here, which we will do right now, I'll explain what that is. Okay, under the Selective Service Act, it says that all men aged 21 through 30 were required to register for military service. And then that number, or that age limit, was actually increased by the time that the war came to an end to 45 years of age. But the result of the Selective Service Act was it increased the total number of military personnel that the United States had. As you can see here at the bottom, it says, by the end of the war, the armed forces numbered over 3.7 million, though only 2 million would actually be sent overseas. And some of the very first who were sent over were sent under General John J. Pershing under the American Expeditionary Force. There was about 15,000 that were sent, but Pershing says we need more men, and so we will get more men. But part of the way that we were able to do that was via the Selective Service Act. Okay, it's not the only way that we are going to fight this war. As mentioned before, World War I is a total war, and thus we're not just fighting it with men, we're also going to be engaging in some domestic policy changes, agricultural changes, and industrial production changes, so that everything that could be used to fight the war would be used. So let's talk briefly about some of that. Okay, it goes on to state here that in addition to mobilizing troops for the war, the United States needed what we call, or what one historian noted, complete economic mobilization. And again, that's because we're fighting a total war, and it's not enough just to send troops, right? You got to feed these troops, you got to make the commodities requisite for war, and so what the United States does is it passes two significant pieces of legislation. The first was the Lever Food and Fuel Control Act, and the second, and I would argue more importantly, was the War Industries Board. Now, what the first act does here, the Lever Food and Fuel Control Act, essentially allowed for the United States to raise agricultural production. Okay, and it says here, Herbert Hoover, who would be the future president of the United States, he sought to raise agricultural production while reducing civilian use of foodstuffs. In other words, we want to increase the amount of food being grown, but decrease the amount of food that's being consumed at home. And the idea here behind the Lever Food and Fuel Control Act was you can't win a war on empty stomachs, and so we have to make sure that we have enough food for the troops. And so, they would call for people to go without on particular days, and you can see you might have a porkless Saturday or a wheatless Wednesday so that you can have a surplus of these things. And by not eating meat on Tuesdays, you're being patriotic, because by not eating it, again, we can send that off to the troops for consumption. Okay, that's basically what the Lever Food and Fuel Control Act was. The War Industries Board, however, took things a little bit further, and I want to talk now briefly about that. I argue here, it says, of all the mobilization agencies, it was the War Industries Board which was the most important. Now, that's my opinion, right? But it was incredibly important. It says, created in 1917, the War Industries Board was run by Wall Street speculator Bernard Baruch, who, quote, exercised a virtual dictatorship over the economy, right? The economy, generally speaking, is always linked to one's ability to fight. This was true in the American Civil War, okay? It's true here in World War I. If there's not enough war-related commodities coming out of your economy, then it's going to be difficult to fight the war. So, the War Industries Board, as it says here, it says all bureaus, both in the United States as well as in allied nations, were required under this board to submit their needs. And with the appropriate approval, the War Industries Bond could appropriate commodities. As one historian noted, the board could allocate raw materials. It could tell manufacturers what to produce, right? You were building Model T cars, well, now you're going to build bombs, or you're going to build tanks, what have you, right? They could order construction of new plants, and with the approval of the president, they could fix prices on various goods, okay? And so between the Selective Service Act, the Lever Food Act, and the War Industries Board, you really see the United States mobilized for war in a way that they hadn't before, because this is a total war, right? There's one other thing that the United States is going to do to, of course, get people behind the war, and that is via propaganda. And there was all forms of propaganda that came out during this time period. But I want to show you 4 posters that today probably would seem a little ridiculous, but at the time they would have been very, very useful and effective. So with that, let's take a look. All right, the very first poster I've got here is an interesting one, and obviously you could take time to take a look at this and dissect it yourself, but I'm going to go ahead and do that for you. What you got here is a depiction of a German militaristic soldier, right? And we have demonized that person to make them look like this sort of brutish ape who has nothing but militarism on his mind, literally via the cap that he's wearing. And what this barbaric militaristic German is doing is crossing the Atlantic to the shores of America, which if you look down at his feet, you can see it says America there, right? He's coming across the shores into the United States in order to steal your liberty. And you know that that's the case because the woman in his hand is in fact supposed to be Lady Liberty, right? He's going to rape, he's going to pillage, he's going to destroy, right? Destroy this mad brute. Okay, and the only way to do that, of course, is to enlist in the United States Army. And of course, this was directed at men and not women. But this type of demonizing your enemy to make them seem more evil, they're here to steal your freedom, right? And if you don't enlist, then this is going to be the result, right? Today, I don't think you would see stuff like this, but it was very effective at the time, okay? You can, of course, come back and take a look at this again and make of it what you will, but let's move on to the next one. All right, what we have here is a little family, little Janie and little Stevie, you know, and Janie's pointing to a book, presumably some type of a history book perhaps, and asks, Daddy, what did you do in the Great War? Right, and there's Dad pondering what he did, right? Little Johnny's too young to go out there and fight, but he's doing it himself. You know, he's replicating the American Revolution with all the virtues of what it means to be an American. And there's Janie, you know, sitting on Daddy's lap, asking him, what is it that you did? And, you know, this is supposed to stir in Father the desire to protect his children, to be patriotic. And And the way that you do that is to do what little Johnny is reenacting there on the floor, and that's to join the military, right? To stop that evil brute who is going to come across and steal your liberty, steal your children, steal your daughters from their beds, right? That kind of thing. Again, probably not something you'd see much today, but effective. Okay, next one. All right, ladies, clearly this one would have been directed at you. It says, sow the seeds of victory, plant and raise your own vegetables. Every garden a munition plant, right? The idea here, ladies, is that even though you can't go out there and fight on the front lines, right, you can fight on the home front by growing a vegetable garden. And it says, write to the National War Garden Commission, Washington, D.C. for free books on gardening, canning, and drying, right? The government is here to help you do this because you are supporting the war effort in this process, okay? And then let's move on to the final one. Right, here she is, be patriotic, sign your country's pledge to save the food, right? And this goes back to that Lever Food Act where you have meatless Wednesdays, or wheatless Wednesdays and porkless Sundays, right? If you see someone eating wheat on Wednesday, they're unpatriotic, right? And that's kind of what's going on here. Pledge yourself to the U.S. Food Administration so that you will not partake of these commodities so that they can be sent over to feed the troops. So this is just a small smattering of the plethora of propaganda that was out there. And of course, feel free to go back and take a look at these again. But I just wanted to give you a sense of, once we declared war, it wasn't just that troops got sent over. We did send troops over, but there's a lot going on the home front that we're going to be doing in order to fight this war. Propaganda, and passing the War Industries Board, the Selective Service Act. Okay, there's a whole host of things. All right, so let's move on. All right, so the United States actually wasn't in the fight for very long. Most of our troops got sent over in 1918, and it says here in my text, it actually says the largest American action of the war. It involved 1.2 million American troops and cost 117,000 American casualties, including 26,000 dead. But it says along the front from Sedan to Flanders, the Germans were in retreat. America, wrote German General Erich Ludendorff, thus became the decisive power in the war. And they were a decisive power. And, they sent millions of troops over to Europe by the time the war came to an end. And it was really America's presence that brought that war to an end. And as it says here, as the war began to end, which the reality is it was beginning to end by the time the United States got involved anyways, we just hastened its end. It says, by the time it came to an end, questions concerning war objectives and peace emerged. Now, remember, Wilson is the sort of person who wants peace without victory, right? He doesn't want anyone to lay territorial claims. He thinks nobody should be delineated as a winner. And in fact, it says, as usual, Wilson continued to assure the world that America had no desire for conquest, no desire for dominion. Rather, he asserted that we seek no indemnities for ourselves, no material compensation for the sacrifices we shall freely make. We are but one of the champions of the rights of mankind. In other words, we don't want anything for our efforts here. We just want to be one among many champions. It says Wilson had his own ideas about what this post-war peace should look like. And part of that post-war peace, what we call Wilson's 14 points, was predicated on this idea that nobody shall be labeled a winner, right? And of course, by the time the war does come to an end, Wilson is going to go to Paris, because there's going to be a peace conference there, and he's going to pitch these 14 points, right? Now, what are these 14 points? Let me read them, albeit briefly, to you, but this is really what Wilson is looking for. It says the first 5 points, in general terms, called for open diplomacy, freedom of the seas, and of course that would have been something that the United States really would have hammered on given the unrestricted sub-warfare that they endured, right? They wanted to remove trade barriers, and they wanted a reduction of armaments and an impartial adjustment of the victor's colonial claims, right? Those are like the first 5 points. The other points generally dealt with territorial claims, okay? But the most important point, at least for Wilson, and perhaps for history, was his 14th point, right? It says, point 14, the capstone in Wilson's thinking called for the creation of a League of Nations, right? Today we refer to that as the United Nations, right? A League of Nations that would secure guarantees of independence and territorial integrity to all countries, great and small, okay? The idea behind the League of Nations, as is also the case with the United Nations, is that when there's a problem, instead of going to war like we did this time with World War I, we would come together as a body of nations and speak about and talk about our issues and be diplomatic, right? So that we do not have to have such carnage, right? And this is Wilson's ultimate desire for peace, right? This is his objective. And this is what he's going to pitch when he finally gets to the Paris Peace Conference. In fact, he's pitching this idea to Congress, because Congress is going to have to get behind it, because anytime a peace treaty is made, the United States Congress has to ratify that treaty. And so, Wilson's sort of pitching his proposed idea that he's going to give when this war comes to an end. And it's about to end. All right, it says, Wilson's 14 points took center stage as the best way for Europe to gain a peace once the fighting ended. And you can see here with the various yellow bullet points, by the time that the war comes to an end, Germany faces the world by itself. All of their allies had left. In fact, their allies had left out. One of the significant things that actually helped them early on was that in 1917, Russia actually pulled out of the war because there was the Bolshevik Revolution, and this actually was a good thing for Germany. And had the United States not entered the war, the thing probably would have turned out differently. But by 1918, the fact that Russia's absent doesn't matter, because one by one, you see Germany's allies dropping out. Bulgaria, Turkey, Austria-Hungary, right? And then the German Kaiser, Wilhelm II, who had governed during this whole time, he abdicates his throne and he's gone. And his government will be replaced by something known as the Weimar Republic. And so, in November of 1918, an armistice will be signed. It says on November 11th at 5 a.m., an armistice was signed. And 6 hours later, that armistice went into effect. So on November 11th at 11 a.m., the guns of World War I fell silent. Hence, you have what we call 11-11-11. On the 11th day, at the 11th hour of the 11th month, World War I ended, and this was known as Armistice Day, right? And the war itself doesn't completely end that day. I mean, there's still some technical things that to be taken care of, but the guns will never be fired again of World War I after Armistice Day. Okay, following Armistice Day, right, all the nations go back home, and there's great celebration. But the one thing that's important to recognize is that for Germany, they actually believed themselves to have won the war. And the reason why they believed that they did an honorable job is because no particular country ever invaded Germany. One of the things that the German government will comment about is to say stuff like, never before has a nation stood alone against the rest of the world, but we Germans did it, and they never entered our country. You should be proud. And the problem with this is that it's in a dangerous illusion, because the Allied powers had won the war. The Central Powers, of which Germany was central to it, had lost. And when the peace conference comes around, the Allied powers, predominantly France, is going to make it quite clear that Germany did not win. And so this is going to cause a lot of bitterness among Germans. And the reason why I bring that up is because World War I is cause number one of World War II, right? Germany is embittered, Germany is punished, and they are going to be looking for a way to rectify the ills, the problems that they see that were placed upon them by the peace treaty, which was called the Treaty of Versailles. And when Hitler decides he's going to gain power, he's going to start poking on some of these periods, these places of bitterness, and people are going to flock to him. And we'll talk more about that, of course, when we get to World War II. But just so you have a sense and an understanding of why this is so important. Okay, so I digressed a bit. Back on, we have Armistice Day. The war is over. It's now time to enact a type of peace treaty. Okay, so it says, following the war, several nations came together in Paris on January 18th, 1919, to discuss a peace treaty which would bring an ultimate end to the war. It says, known as the Paris Peace Conference, Woodrow Wilson personally attended the meeting and, quote, insisted that his cherished League of Nations come first. In other words, if we want a lasting peace, we're going to have to implement Wilson's 14 points. We're going to have to create this League of Nations. Okay? It goes on to state here that what would emerge from the conference would be the Treaty of Versailles. And the reason why it's called the Treaty of Versailles is because it was signed at the Versailles Palace in Versailles. And it says, and within the scope of the treaty, Wilson did get his League of Nations. But he also had to make some concessions on territorial gains. Remember, this man, Wilson, says there should be no victor, right? Peace without victory. And part of that meant that nobody got to lay claim to any new territory. Well, the League of Nations was adopted in part because Wilson had to concede on some of those desires that he had, right? He had to make compromises. And some nations are going to get more land than others, and this is going to cause bitterness as well. At any point, the Treaty of Versailles is drafted. A preliminary draft is sent to Germany, and essentially the Germans have a lot of problems with the treaty, evidenced by the 443 pages of criticism that they sent back concerning the Treaty of Versailles. And I'll explain here in the next slide as we conclude what they had a big issue with. But ultimately, Germany is going to be blamed for World War I. They're going to be forced to do a whole host of things, and they're going to lose a bunch of stuff. And Germany's saying, look, we were honorable. No one invaded our land, right? We didn't lose this war. And the Allied powers were under no mistake of whom had beaten whom. And so when Germany decides that they're initially not going to sign the Treaty of Versailles, the French military begins to rearm, and they threaten to move into Germany. Okay? What happens, of course, is the Germans don't want to have their land invaded, so they eventually acquiesce. It says, when the Germans refused to sign, the French prepared to move their army across the Rhine. Finally, on June 28, 1919, the Germans gave in and signed the Treaty of Versailles in the Hall of Mirrors at the Versailles Palace. And this peace treaty was supposed to bring about a lasting peace. And it doesn't do that. What the Treaty of Versailles really does is it creates animosity. It creates tension. And let's move to the next slide, our final slide, and I'll explain why it does that. Okay, the reason why the Treaty of Versailles doesn't actually create a peace is because of what it does to Germany, right? Clearly there was a winner, and France and other Allied powers wanted Germany to know that it wasn't them. So while the Treaty of Versailles implemented the League of Nations, right, and this is supposed to be a governing body, right, where we all come together and be diplomatic instead of blow each other to bits, right? But in addition to the League of Nations, the Treaty of Versailles also set strict terms upon Germany. For example, it said that the German military and navy had to be restricted. As I understand it, the German standing army could only consist of 100,000 men, and they couldn't have a navy. Okay? And when you think about the causes of World War I, this idea of nationalism and militarism, right, that's a big blow. That's a big blow to any nation, that you can't protect yourself because what we saw from you was you were an aggressor, so we're not going to allow you the means with which to be aggressive, right? German territories in Africa and the Pacific, as well as lands that they had acquired during the war, were taken from them. And in fact, when Hitler begins to rise to power, one of the things he's going to argue is that there's too many Germans and not enough Germany. It's what he called Lebensraum. Living space is what that German word means. Okay? And part of the reason for this lack of Lebensraum, or living space, is that many of the German lands were taken from them via the Treaty of Versailles. Okay, Germany was forced to pay reparations to France and Britain and others, and this is going to bankrupt their economy. In fact, during the 1920s and 30s, the German economy is going to go right down the sewer. Okay, thank you, Versailles Treaty. And then finally, there's the Article 231, which was the War Guilt Clause, which effectively said, hey, yeah, you're responsible, Germany, for this war. Okay, and that really throws salt into an already festering wound. And the Treaty of Versailles is going to do nothing but cause tension, and it is not going to create peace. And ironically, and I will conclude it with this, ironically, this flawed peace, which I believe the Treaty of Versailles created, was never adopted by the United States. It's ironic because Wilson was sort of the architect of the League of Nations and many of the things in the peace treaty, and unfortunately, for various reasons, the United States Congress refused to sign the Treaty of Versailles. They refused to ratify that treaty. And that's an important thing, because when Hitler begins to defy the Treaty of Versailles in the 1930s, the United States has a way out. They don't have to deal with Hitler because we didn't sign the treaty. It's not our problem. Okay. All right, guys. I think we've done quite well here today, so let's end on that note. Enjoyed, hopefully, and if you have any questions, let me know. All right. Go in peace. Be warm and filled, and may the Force be with you.